upper room, and I was thinking about when I was in fifth grade. Fifth grade was special to me because it was the first love of my life occurred when I was in the fifth grade. You got to understand, Roberta Gonzalez was absolutely gorgeous. Gorgeous. And the fact that she noticed me, I couldn't believe it. I was stunned when one of her friends passed me a note that says, Roberta likes you. She didn't just notice me, she liked me. There was a chance, as slight as it was, that she might love me someday. Well, when I realized that not only had I come to her attention, but she actually liked me, I knew that the only logical thing was to offer up a gift of my love to her to help this thing that we're beginning to have continue down the road. And so I gave to Roberta the most valuable thing I had. You guessed it. It was my Denver Bronco Letterman jacket. That was the most valuable thing I had. And I offered it to her. I gave it to her friend saying, well, if she likes me, then here's what she can have that's mine, that we can now share life together. And she took it and she gave it to Roberta, and Roberta wore it. She wore it the rest of that day. I remember going home at night thinking, I have found my future wife, Roberta Gonzalez, Roberta Shaw. How does that sound? I thought it through. The next day I thought, what does today hold? Is today the day that she comes to me wearing my Letterman's jacket and says, I accept whatever you're proposing to me, because I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with you. Well, it was at the first recess that her friend came back to me, handed me my jacket, and said, she's not interested anymore. Is that love? I thought I was in love. I really was sure that this was love. How could it get so painful so quickly? Have you ever experienced anything like that? It reminds me of the guy who wanted to marry this lady, so he sent her a love letter every day of the year. He proposed that he would send her something in communication every day for 365 days in a row. And he did it. He expressed his love to her. There was no way she could deny how much he loved her, the sacrifice, the time, the effort that he put in. As the story goes, she married the mailman. Is that all that love is about? Is you make this attempt and it usually blows up in your face? We're going to talk about that. Here's the great news. We are in the upper room. I don't know how long we'll be in the upper room, but we're in the upper room. We got there last lesson, showed how the disciples were sent by Jesus, and now we're there. If you can picture it in your mind, it's a large room. There aren't a lot of furnishings. There may be some mats on the ground, maybe a very low table that they would recline next to with pillows. There are torches probably on the walls that had been lit because it was now nighttime. We are there. And so I'm going to ask you to turn to John chapter 13. Now we're going to read through and study through the entire episode that takes place in the upper room. What happens here is of such significance that we're going to live here for some time and just understand what it was that the last things Jesus needed to say to his followers and how they may or may not apply to us 2,000 years later. So here we are in John chapter 13, starting in verse 1. If you're there, I hope you've turned there. Let's read together. We'll just cover the first verse and then kind of do some unpacking of that verse. It reads this way. Now before the Passover feast, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. You might remember we talked about that phrase, to the end means completely or perfectly. Now, I want to go back to that phrase, the hour had come. That's not the first time that we read about that. Jesus actually, earlier in chapter 12, we'll talk about that, but I want to take even further back to John chapter 2, where Jesus is being implored by his mother to perform a miracle or to do something special at the wedding where they ran out of wine, such an embarrassment to their friends or family, whoever they were there celebrating. And she, remember, comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, do something. And he says to her in John chapter 2, verse 4, he says, woman, what does this have to do with me? And we see this phrase for the first time from Jesus' lips. My hour has not yet come. So when we read in chapter 13, verse 1, that his hour had come, we go clear back to the beginning of his ministry, the very first miracle ever, and he says then, my hour has not yet come. Meaning there is a point in time that I am targeting. This is not it. Now, going back to chapter 12, if you want to just turn the page, we see that Jesus says to his disciples, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. He is saying, it's now. It's now. My whole life is pointed to this moment in time. He goes on to say this about this moment. If you think this is kind of no big deal to Jesus, like business as usual, we've arrived at the place, I knew we would arrive, let's get through it, that kind of thing. Listen to what he says in chapter 12, verse 27. He says, now my soul is troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? Instead, for this reason I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Which right there we get the whole mission of Jesus in that one phrase. He has come to glorify the name of the Father. And now watch what happens. Then a voice came from heaven saying, I have glorified it and will glorify it again. All right? What an incredible moment there, that the disciples around Jesus, they hear an audible voice. This happens a few times. If you're not familiar with the fact that from time to time in Jesus' ministry, a voice from heaven, audibly heard by others, comes out. It first happened when he was baptized. This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased, right? It happens again on the Mount of Transfiguration. And now the disciples are around him, and they see for the first time Jesus is really in a difficult place. He says, the hour has come, and then he prays and says, Father, glorify your name. And from heaven comes this, who knows what it was like. I don't think it was a gentle whisper. I think it was a thunderous pronouncement. I have glorified my name, the Father says, and I will glorify my name, meaning through you I have been honored, and I will be honored by what's about to happen. Now remember, John, who's writing this, was there. He heard the voice. He is the one that says the time had come for his departure from this world. I want to latch onto that phrase right there. There's something significant in there that we just don't want to overlook. Departure from this world. That is what you and I, pretty much for the most part, would call death. But death in God's Word is different than departure from this world. That's really important. I was doing a memorial service yesterday, and I wanted to express that to the people who were there, that the man who was a friend of mine who passed away, he did not actually die. He actually just departed from this world. That's an important difference. Because in God's Word, to die, according to Paul, when he wrote about the wages of sin, to die is to be separated from God. So when we depart this world, we're not dying. Nothing ceases to exist. That's kind of what we define death as. We are simply departing this world. It is the separation from God that is death. And that's what we need to be more leery of. You might remember last week in our lesson, we talked about a man who had been lame for 38 years. And remember, Jesus healed him, and he got up, picked up his mat and walked, and the Jewish leaders were upset because he was breaking the Sabbath. And he finds Jesus in the temple, and Jesus' words to him are really interesting. I'm just going to read them. In John 5:14, he says, see, you're well again, aren't you? Stop sinning, or something worse will happen to you. That's interesting, isn't it? You and I can't imagine anything worse than being lame for 38 years. But Jesus is defining death there. Stop sinning. Your sin is separating you from God. And what's worse than being lame for 38 years is that you could be eternally separated from God because of your sin. So stop sinning. That's the real issue, Jesus says. The real issue isn't that you've been lying on a mat for 38 years. The real issue, your real problem, is that you sin and that separates you from God. That, according to Paul, is death. Really important. So we come across this phrase, he will depart from this world. That is not death. That is simply a change of location. For us, when we call that death, we're simply changing location. Now, should we die in our sin, now that indeed will be the death of our soul, because we'll be totally separated from God from that point on. Really important idea here. Now Jesus, you can see the kind of the angst, not that Jesus worried, but you can see the stress on him, that the time has come. And I want to ask you to discuss something amongst yourselves. And that is this. If you knew, as Jesus knew, if you knew you were within hours of going to the cross, of taking the sins of the world, which you and I can't even imagine, but let's say you knew that you were going to, as we say, die within hours, and you're talking to a bunch of friends, how would you feel? What would you be doing? Can you talk about that for just a moment? Well, I sure would have loved to have heard what you said in your group about what would be going through your mind. What would you be doing? What are the things you would be saying? Really interesting. I want to go back one more time to the verse 1 of chapter 13. And it says this. John writes, having loved his own who were in the world, he now loved them to the end, or completely or perfectly. What does that look like? Now, when we started this teaching, I talked about how love can be so misconstrued and misunderstood. I want to get back into that, but I want you to understand something about how important this is that we talk about this. In John chapters 1 through 12, the word love, which is the word agape in the Greek, and we're going to talk more about that, but the word agape is used 8 times, chapters 1 through 12. In chapters 13 through 17, which we're about to venture into, and we are now in, the word agape, Greek word for love, is used 31 times. You see why it's important that we really get a proper understanding of what is meant by John and what is meant by Jesus when he uses that word? So I've got a question for you, but I got to set the question up. Again, you'll have another discussion question, but I want to set it up with a story. It's a well-known story, but I got to tell it. It's one of my favorite stories. It's about a pastor who was doing children's church, or had gathered children in the auditorium on a Sunday morning up on the stage, and was doing his talk to the children before they're let go, or whatever the case may be. And he asked them a question. He says, now children, he says, I want to ask you, what is brown and furry and has a bushy tail and chews on nuts and keeps nuts in his cheek? And he waited and no hands went up. And he was getting nervous. He's thinking, this should be an easy one. All of a sudden in the front row, a little boy's hand shot up. And he was just relieved to say, okay, can you tell me what I was just describing? And the little boy in the front row then said this, classic. He says, well, it really sounds like a squirrel, but I'm going to go with Jesus. The answer is Jesus. Isn't that the way we do it? When we're in a church setting, when we're in a spiritual setting, we think that there are just the answers that are just the proper answers. The answer everybody expects, and we're going to give that answer, as opposed to the real answer, to what reality is. So as I give you this question, I'm going to challenge you to give your honest answer to this, not the church answer, not the we're in a spiritual community answer that everybody wants to hear. So here's my question to you. Where or from whom did you get your concept of love, and what is that idea of love? All right? I confess to you that when I was in the 5th grade, my idea of love was really pretty shallow and skewed. I'm not sure where I got that. I have some guesses, but do you know? Do you know from whom or where you got your idea of love? And what is that idea of love? Now, don't give a Bible answer. Don't give the answer that you think you're expected to give. Just answer it honestly now in the group in which you're sitting. How you define and understand love is one of the most important things you can consider in this life. I want to read to you a letter that was sent by a college student to her parents and kind of illustrate what I'm saying. It says, "Dear Mom and Dad, I have so much to tell you. Because of the fire in my dorm set off by the student riots, I experienced temporary lung damage and had to go to the hospital. While I was there, I fell in love with an orderly, and we have moved in together. I dropped out of school when I found out I was pregnant. And he got fired because of his drinking. So we're going to move to Alaska, where we might get married after the birth of the baby. Signed, your loving daughter. P.S. None of that really happened, but I did flunk my chemistry class, and I wanted you to keep it in perspective." Isn't that great? We're never shocked by anyone that says, "I fell in love." But when someone says, "I fell in love," and then you're kind of waiting for what's going to happen next, it can get pretty strange, can't it? I love the fact that she is simply looking for some perspective here. You know, life could be a lot worse than the fact that I flunked my chemistry class. Ordinarily, Dad, Mom, I know you'd be really upset about that, but now that I put it in perspective for you, I love that approach. So what I'm saying is that love is about perspective, and if we're honest, most of us associate love with emotions and feelings, things like that. I want to give you a definition that love is an act of selflessness founded in the perspective that another is of such great value that a commitment to their well-being is the only thing that makes sense. But it is actions that show value of others, creates value in others. Instead of trying to take something from them, it creates value in them because you are committed to their well-being. The author Josh Harris once put it this way. He said, "The world takes us to a silver screen on which flickering images of passion and romance play. And as we watch, the world says, 'This is love.' God, on the other hand, takes us to the foot of a tree on which a naked and bloodied man hangs and says, 'This is love.'" Is he close? I think he's right on. Romans 5:8 says, "God demonstrated his love in that even though we are sinners, Christ died for us." You see, that is a choice, it's an action, and it's an action based on the well-being of others, is the idea. So let's go back to our definition, and the way I started it was an act of unselfishness. Well, you see that in that verse, Romans 5:8, right? Where it says, "Christ died for us." What an act of selflessness that was. Next, I said it's caring for another and creating such value in them. That verse says that while we were still sinners, even though really in of ourselves we have diminished our value, Jesus still died for us. And then the commitment to our well-being is in the beginning of that verse where it says, God demonstrated his love. He was committed. It is that kind of love, a choice, a perspective, a decision, an act that is to benefit others. That is how God defines love. We see it in Romans 5:8. You see it in John 3:16, of course, right? For God so loved the world, he so loved all of us that he gave his one and only Son. He created value in us by sacrificially giving to us what we did not deserve. And that's how he defines love. I want to say one more thing about that phrase, the act of selflessness. It goes deeper than many of us want to believe. We tend to think if I do something for you, that's an act of selflessness. And in fact, it's the beginning of an act of selflessness. But actually, selflessness goes beyond, let me do something for you. It goes to the point of, I'm going to do something for you, and even if you don't appreciate it, that's okay. And even if you don't give it back to me, and even if you don't reciprocate that act back to me, or give back to me in some form, that's okay, because the selflessness goes to that depth. Does that make sense? It actually, the way I've defined it before, is it's not because of or if, it's in spite of. So selfless act of love is, in spite of the fact that you may not even appreciate it, you may not even acknowledge it, and you may not even give back to me, that doesn't matter. That doesn't change what I am willing to do for you. That, in fact, is love. Now, we've dispelled the idea that it's about emotions and feelings and something you can fall into and out of, like a tar pit, or a gravel pit. You fall in and out of love, as we often describe it. So we understand that, and again, it's not that there can't be emotion involved. Jesus was very emotional before he went to the cross. Okay, so it's not a lack of emotion, it's just that it's not about emotion. So let's get back to our text in John chapter 13. We pick it up in verse 2. It says, the evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Okay, let's pause there, and I just want to say there's something really obvious here, isn't there? And the obvious thing is this, that he is now demonstrating what love looks like. If those guys could not see that he was willing to do something none of them were willing to do, as an act of selfless commitment to them, putting value in them, showing them that they are of great value, if they couldn't see that, then, they're missing the obvious. Paul wrote about it in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. He said this, have the same mindset. I love that word. Think this way. Have the same mindset of Christ Jesus. Obvious question, what then is that mindset? The mindset is this, who being in very nature God. He was not, in other words, making an exception. I'm God, but I'll make an exception this time and do something that God wouldn't normally do. No, this was his very nature. God's very nature, he says, is to not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. Paul was referring to what they saw in the upper room. He didn't just say, I'll make an exception and serve you and make you feel good. This is his very nature. It's what he does. And so when he loves us to the full extent, he is simply letting what is in him flow out of him to show us his definition of love. So it's pretty obvious. You have to be honestly kind of dense to miss this. Let's move from the obvious to the oblivious. Is there something that we could possibly be oblivious to that I want to focus in on? And I think there is something here. And that is this, that he washed their feet, and we're being oblivious if we don't realize that within the context of that phrase, there was one who was planning his destruction. And there is no reference to the fact that he skipped Judas. Don't be oblivious to the fact that when he went to wash people's feet, he did not choose the people who were just nice to him, the people who just had affection for him. He equally gave of himself to everybody around that table or in that circle, and that included the one that he already knew was planning to destroy him. For what? 30 pieces of silver. Don't be oblivious to the fact that love does not show partiality. That is huge. Love does not distinguish between skin color or occupation or gender or background. Love as God sees it does never distinguish based on any of those things. But here's the kicker. It doesn't distinguish either based on what that person thinks about you, or what that person has planned for you or has done to you. Do you get that? Don't be oblivious to that. That is maybe the greatest definition of love. That's what Paul was saying when he said, while we were still sinners. He does not wait for us to get our act together to love us. And so by that, he defines love. We need to get this right, because most of us are living with a skewed idea of what love is, because it's all about the conditions being right. I love you because you are fill in the blank. You're rich, you're famous, you're beautiful, I love you if you love me. If you show affection to me, I love you then. No, that is not love. Love is in spite of anything you are or may do, I will do what's in your best interest for your well-being. I don't know how you feel about that, but that blows my mind. Let's go back to the text. Verses 12 through 17 now. Let's jump down a ways. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. He says, do you understand what I've done for you? You know what he's saying, right? I've just demonstrated what real love is. Not what you think it is, most likely. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should also do that for one another. You should also wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. The other word for example there is a pattern. I've set in place a pattern. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you'll be blessed if you do them. Incredibly important that you know that it is up to us to choose the blueprint, to choose the pattern of love that is absolutely accurate, not fictitious love, not fake love, not counterfeit love, because the reality is most of us are living with a very skewed idea, and that's why we have the problems that we have. Let me illustrate it this way. In the English language, we have, unfortunately, just one word for this idea, and it's the word love. Okay? That's not so in the language in which the Bible was written. For example, I love fall. I love fall. We're at the end of fall here. I love fall. I love football. I love pizza. And I love my wife. And I love God. It's really unfortunate. Now, if all those are on the same level in my mind, I'm hosed, right? I'm really in trouble. It's unfortunate that we only have one word to describe all those different affections I have as though they're all the same, right? Hopefully, my wife is behind the camera here going, yeah, I hope you feel differently about me than you do about football and pizza. I do, honey. I really do. Okay, we got to put that aside. The Greeks had 4 words. Actually, it had a 5th, but let's focus on the 4 major words they had for love. The first one is storge. That's a family kind of love. That's a love that a parent would have for a child. The second one is phileo. Phileo is the brotherly love, a friend kind of love. Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. That's where we get that. So you have storge, you have phileo, and then you have eros, from which we get the word erotic. That's a passionate, physical, that kind of a drive kind of love. That's what we would call maybe a crush. Sometimes the Bible actually makes that akin to lust, right? I have this physical passion for you, which again is something God gave us, but it can run amok. Okay, so you have those 3, and then you have the gold standard. The gold standard in the Greek language is the word agape. Guess which of these 4 words is always used when it speaks of God's love and of how Jesus loved and the kind of love Jesus calls us to. Okay, it is agape. It is the unselfish, unconditional commitment to the betterment of another person is the idea. It is the action. It is not just an emotion that I fall in and out of. Okay, it's not Roberta saying I like you now, I don't like you anymore, less than 24 hours later. Okay, really important that we get that differentiation. So we've dealt with the obvious. What Jesus did in the upper room was obviously love, right? It was an act of unselfishness as a pattern for them. We've dealt with the oblivious, that we are mostly oblivious to the fact that in that context, Jesus chose to love to demonstrate how he wants Judas to feel. Let's not be oblivious to that, because we tend to qualify our love based on who we're talking about and how much they deserve our love. So there's the obvious, there's the oblivious. Now let's wrap this up by talking about one who was obstinate and see if you can relate to the obstinate one in the setting in which we find Jesus and his disciples in the upper room. You might have noticed that I left a gap there in the reading, and the gap there is where Jesus comes to Peter and wants to wash his feet, and Peter says, no way, no how, I'm not going to do that. His pride is so enormous that he says, that's humiliating to have you wash my feet, to have you act like a servant to me. I'm not going to put up with that. That's when Jesus says, well, if you don't let me wash your feet, then you have no part of me. And then that pride kicks up to a different level, and pride in Peter says, then wash all of me, give me a bath, then just don't stop at my feet. I want all of you. That's how committed I am to you, Jesus. And that kind of bravado is what we see in Peter and in some of us. Obviously, Jesus responded by, you don't need a bath, Peter. You don't need a bath. All you need to do is accept my demonstration of love and now see if you can grow into it. Peter's claim here is basically, I am so committed to you. You have no idea. And later in the upper room, and even in other times, he has said, Jesus, though others will fall away. And he's looking at the other disciples. He's comparing himself, which is kind of foreshadowing. That'll happen again, and I hope we can get to it, not in this lesson, but another lesson. But he says, compare me to the others. They will all fall away. Not me, not Ma, not your main servant, dude. He says, my commitment to you is so great that others will fall away. I'll go with you all the way. I'll die with you, Jesus. And that's when Jesus, he says to Peter, by the time the rooster crows, you will have denied me 3 times. Again, another prophecy of Jesus that we know came true. All right. I want to fast forward now. Okay. So they've been in the upper room. Jesus goes to the cross. Peter's denied him 3 times, even though in all his bravado, Peter was trying to exclaim how committed he was, but in fact, we find out he may have had great feelings for Jesus, but he wasn't committed. And then we fast forward past the resurrection. Jesus appears to them a couple times, and then Peter does something interesting. He says, enough of this. He hasn't had a one-on-one conversation with Jesus, so Peter says, I'm done with this. I got to go back to what I know, what I'm good at. It's all about Peter. It's all about, me feeling good about myself, me feeling like I have a purpose. I messed this up. I'm sure Jesus wants nothing to do with me. You see, he had no concept of Jesus' love. He goes back to fishing. He says, I'm going back to fishing. And some of the disciples go with him. They go out into the Sea of Galilee. Okay, Jesus is risen from the dead, but he's not hanging out with them, really. They're out fishing. They've been out fishing all night. No fish. This is reminiscent of how they first met. Okay, this is what's classic about Jesus. This is reminiscent of when they first met. They've caught no fish. Jesus shows up. It's early in the morning, the Bible says. It's still probably a little dark. And he yells out to them. He says, hey guys, have you gotten any fish? And they say, no, we've gotten no fish. He says, throw the net on the other side of the boat. Remember when he did that before? They do it. Their nets are full, something like 151 fish. They count them. I don't know what it was exactly, but along those lines. All of a sudden, John, who knows Jesus the best, who has proven his love for Jesus the most, he says, it's the Lord. Okay, it's kind of dark. Not sure who's talking to him. That's the Lord. Peter still has that impulsive nature. He jumps into the water. He can't wait for the boat to get to the shore. He jumps in the water, goes over. Jesus provides breakfast for them. He feeds them breakfast, and then Jesus pulls Peter aside. He has not had a one-on-one conversation with Jesus to this moment since Peter messed up royally, since he denied him 3 times. And here's the conversation. John chapter 21, verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said, starting in verse 15, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Go to what he says to him. Son of John, calls him Simon. Jesus had given him a different name. Do you remember what it was? It was Rocky. It was Petra. It was Peter. Jesus gave him the name we know him by. His real name was Simon. Look what Jesus says. He says, basically, Peter, we now have a distance between us, don't we? Ever feel that with somebody? There's something missing. There's a gap between us. We're not aligned. So I'm going to give you the name that you probably expect me to give you, right? Remember the name that your mom would call you when you're in trouble? Simon, do you love me more than these? Now what's there? The word is agape, of course. That's the word that Jesus always used. Are you committed to me more than these? Now when he said these, Some people think he was pointing to the other disciples. I don't think so. Jesus never promoted competition amongst his disciples. He never did that. They did that on their own. Do you love me more than these? I believe he's pointing to the boat and the nets and all the things that was his former life. It was symbolic representation of his former life that he has now returned to. He says, I want to ask you, are you going to go back? Are you going to go back to life as it was before you met me? Do you love me more than these? Are you committed to me is the question. And look how he responds. Look how Peter responds. He says, yes, Lord. He said, you know that I love you. The word is not agape. The word is phileo. Jesus says, do you agape me? And he says, oh, you know I phileo you. See, Jesus does something amazing here. He allows Peter to be honest about who he really is. The bravado in the upper room, the brash, I'm committed, is gone. He has been humbled. And now when Jesus says, are you committed? Are you loyal in spite of anything to me? He knows Peter's going to respond honestly now. The bravado is gone. I love you like a brother, Jesus. You know that. Jesus says, feed my sheep. I have a job for you. I understand where you're at. He asks him again, Peter, do you agape me? And Peter responds again, Lord, you know how I love you like a brother. I phileo you. And he says again, I still have a job for you. You are not where you claimed you were. You are not where you want to be. You're not where you will be someday. But right where you are, look what he says to him. Right where you are, I have a job for you. Does that resonate with you? The third time, Jesus, look what he does. He asks him again in this text. He says, Peter, do you phileo me? And it says Peter was hurt. Why was he hurt? Because he realized that Jesus knows what he's saying. I'm not there yet. I'm not totally committed. I thought I was. I'm not totally committed. I still care for you as a brother. And it's as though Jesus says, I know that about you. And I know that you love me as a brother. And I still have a work for you. Now, you say, so what's the point? What's the big deal? I hope you're encouraged by this, because now we're going to get to the good news and the bad news. First, the bad news. The bad news is that Jesus knows exactly the way you love. He knows exactly how I love and how I come up short, just like he knew about Peter. That's the bad news. It can be out there in the open. All my bravado, all the things I portray about myself being totally understanding and communicating love the way it ought to be are not usually true. He knew that about Peter. That's the bad news. He knows that about you and me. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. He believes it'll change. Because look what he does. Verse 18. He looks at Peter. I can see him putting his arm on his shoulder, and he says this, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. What is he talking about? How we dress ourselves? No, he's saying when you were younger, you did life on your terms. The day is coming when you will submit to whatever I have for you. And I tell you what I have for you. And John now explains what he was saying. Verse 19, chapter 21, John says, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he says to Peter, follow me. What happened there? He said, you know, when you're younger, you did life on your terms. You're still doing life on your terms. You want me to think that you have grown into a commitment. I know you're not there yet. But let me tell you, I'm prophesying something. And that is, a day is coming when someone will lead you to your death. And it did happen. And they'll lead you to your death, a death you wouldn't naturally choose, especially when you were younger. But they'll do that because you will now understand what love is. History tells us, tradition tells us that Peter was crucified upside down. They went to crucify him and he said, I do not believe I'm worthy to be crucified the same way my Lord was. They turned him upside down and crucified him. What Jesus predicted came true. What was Jesus saying? He's saying the same thing about Peter that he says about you. And he says about me, and that is, I know you're not there yet. I know that. And here's how much love I have, or here's the manner of love I love you with. In spite of the fact that you are not where you claim to be, and now you're very humble and you realize you're not what you claim to be, I'm telling you, the day will come when you will love. You are on a journey, and you will love the way I've demonstrated love. Now, he says, the next step, follow me. That's what he says to Peter. It's what he says to you. It's what he says to me. I get it. You're not who you claim to be. I get it. You're not what you wish you were. I get it. But someday you will, because you're on a journey, and that journey begins with the next step, and the next step is follow me. Love, as God defines it, is risky business. It's risky business because it makes us vulnerable. We give to others, we care for others, we do what's best for others, in spite of the fact it may never come back to us. We may never benefit from loving people that way. We are simply obeying the words of Jesus. I love the way C.S. Lewis puts it. It's kind of a lengthy quote. Hang with me here. He said this, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, the only place outside heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers of love is hell. Wow. You know, the week before Jesus was crucified, he was in a friend's home, not far from Jerusalem, and a woman of ill repute, as they say, came and broke a bottle of perfume over his head and poured it over him. It was said that the value of the contents of that bottle, it was a bottle of perfume, but the value was 1 year's wages. I don't know what a year's wages was then. Let's say today that a year's wages, I don't know, it doesn't matter, throw something out, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, okay, something like that. Can you imagine having a bottle with that kind of value and breaking it and pouring it on Jesus? You talk about a commitment. By the way, Judas led the jeers against that woman, saying, what a waste. What a waste. What a waste to show that commitment, show that sacrifice to Jesus. And Jesus stood up for her, if you remember this, and he said, enough, stop it. What she has done is he calls it a beautiful thing, and it will be talked about as long as they talk about me. Another prophecy of Jesus comes true, because here we are 2,000 years later talking about him, and we talk about her. He says basically she knows what love is. Sacrificial, unconditional, costly, risky. How risky was that? I've heard that the IRS has a special fund called the Cheaters Fund. Okay, and what this is, again, I don't know for sure if it's true, but it's what I've heard. What this is it's a category, it's a fund where people can send money into it who feel guilty for having cheated the IRS, and they will ask no questions. So a person can anonymously send in money. They tell a story that one letter arrived where a person wrote in and said, I've been cheating you for years and I can no longer sleep. So what you'll see enclosed is a money order for $10,000. If I still can't sleep, I will send you the rest. I just thought that's such a perfect example of how most of us view love. I'm going to hold back. I'm going to give to you, but I'm going to hold back because it's kind of risky. And if I still don't have any peace, I'll continue to try to love you. But as far as taking that incredible risk, I'm not willing to do that. So you'll get a little piece of me, but you're not going to get all of me. See how different that is than the woman who broke the bottle of perfume over Jesus' head? Jesus' definition of love is such the gold standard. It is so absolute. It is so clear. And you and I are now on a journey to learn to love. It's risky business. But there's nothing else that will help us live in the footsteps of Jesus, like loving unconditional in the way that he did.